Hey everyone, welcome Baltimore County Fire Department EMS Academy. For those who I haven't met, my name is Sean Barinholtz. I am an adult anesthesia and ICU provider, a physician at Hopkins. I thought my backdrop would bring you a little bit more into my world for tonight's training. I'm also an active member of Pikesville Volunteer Fire Company, Baltimore County, and I have the honor of serving as one of the associate medical directors for Baltimore County Fire Department. On behalf of Dr. Andy Pollack in the Medical Director's Office, on behalf of the EMS Office, Chief Nats, EMS Training Academy staff, and Captain Lenny Stewart, thanks for what you guys do every day, and thank you so much for your dedication to lifelong learning. A big shout out to Ashley Brooks. Ashley is a volunteer at Pikesville. She is helping us with our CEUs. Ashley isn't able to join us tonight, but she sent us a link. I will be posting that link as well as a QR code. We're going to try a QR code this time too, posting that into the chat later on in the training, and I'll also announce it. Click on that link or use your camera to use the QR code, enter in some basic information and get your CEUs, your MIEMSS CEUs. If you have questions about your MIEMSS CEUs or past attendance or training records, hang out with us afterwards and we'd be happy to help you and answer your questions. Great. So tonight, super excited to have with us two speakers. Scott Goldstein currently serves as the Director of Masada Healthcare Consulting, specializing in workplace violence prevention, verbal de-escalation, and healthcare-specific self-defense. He recently served as the captain of Station 32, Pikesville Volunteer Fire Company in Baltimore County. With 38 years of experience in the fire service, he is an instructor evaluator for the Maryland Fire and Rescue Institute of University of Maryland, MIEMSS Services EMTB Evaluator, American Heart Association BLS Regional Faculty, and Director of Training Emergency Volunteer Project. He holds numerous certifications in EMS operations, fire suppression, and TECC. Koos Hamburger is a paramedic and member of Chestnut Ridge Volunteer Fire Company. He has been an ALS provider since the early 1980s and has served as both ALS mentor and instructor in various capacities over his decades with the Volunteer Fire Service. He's a trained mediator specializing in alternate dispute resolution, conflict management, and crisis negotiation. He has a lifelong interest in public health and emergency medicine. He's a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University and Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters at the School of Public Health in Brussels. He's the author of The Two Faces of Richard, documenting the most extensive face transplant in history, and is currently working on an independent long-term project at the Shock Trauma Center. He teaches part-time at Masada Healthcare as an instructor in workplace violence prevention and verbal de-escalation at the MedStar Health System. Coach, thank you so much, and I'm handing it off to you. We super appreciate both of you guys being with us today.
Very good. Sean, thank you very much for the kind introduction and welcome to everybody. We very much appreciate, both Scott and I very much appreciate all of you joining us tonight. Everybody's got busy schedules and hopefully we'll make it worth your time. We'll keep this relatively informal. Both Scott and I have different areas of interest and expertise, and we'll just have a conversation that we're going to share with all of you. And hopefully, I don't see the list of people who are attending, but I know there are a lot of people with a lot of years of experience, and hopefully everybody else will chime in a little bit and we can maintain it as a solid conversation. So tonight's topic is workplace violence de-escalation techniques for pre-hospital providers. It's interesting, the Baltimore County Fire Department, I spoke with some of the leadership still today. We are in the process of building an SOP for this. There currently is none. So up till now, many of us have been sort of flying by the seat of our pants, and that technique doesn't work real well some of the time. So we are going to go over some things tonight, some of which may not be new, but hopefully it'll be a skill set that will be refreshing or be a refresher for you, and hopefully put some things in context to make you think about things that will keep you safe. So Scott, you want to add anything?
No, thank you all for joining.
So just to let everybody know, neither Scott and I have any financial interest in tonight's presentation. We have 5 objectives. The first one is to really understand the scope of workplace violence in pre-hospital care. It's interesting, as we were preparing for this, it became quite apparent that the amount of good literature and good research on this topic is missing. There are a couple of articles, we'll go over those, but it isn't clear what the scope of workplace violence is. Generally speaking, however, it's much larger than we anticipated. And before we go any further, if I can ask all of you, we're going to do two of these sort of impromptu questionnaires. If over the next couple of minutes, if you have been verbally assaulted or felt that you have been a victim of verbal workplace violence in your capacities as EMS clinicians, would you raise your hand, and then Sean is actually going to count that up. That'll give us a rough idea. So this is just verbal. We'll deal with the nonverbal later on. So the second part of our objectives is to reduce the death and injury, both physical and emotional injury, loss of work time, et cetera, by learning effective means at dealing with violence issues, both recognizing and preventing it and coming up with effective coping mechanisms. The next one is identifying signs of escalating behavior. And again, we know most of these, it's intuitive, but there's some stuff that we're going to go over, and ways to counteract these behaviors. And then finally, to avoid the need for going hands-on. That ultimately is the goal of all of this de-escalation stuff, so that we do not have to devolve to the point where hands-on is the only option. Sometimes it will become the only option, but rarely. And so we will try and go over the deciding factors, your process of thinking, how much time you may or may not have, and how you get to that point of using physical defensive mechanisms. And ultimately, the goal is to make sure that everybody goes home after their shift.
We had 12 hands raised out of 60.
12 hands out of 60. Okay. And then if you could all use your clapping emoji, if you have had a physical altercation, either with injury or without, but somebody has physically assaulted you in your capacity as an EMS provider. Okay. So we all sort of know intuitively, and by reading the newspaper and by reading EMS literature, that not a day goes by that there isn't some type of assault, some type of workplace violence incident in the EMS world. And these are just some quick video grabs, screen grabs of articles, and they are across the entire country. Sometimes people are able to get out of the situation with relatively minimal physical injury. And unfortunately, sometimes lives are lost in the line of duty. The picture of the EMT in the center was a Miss Russo, EMT Russo out of New York City, who was a survivor of the World Trade Center attack. And on a lunch break while she was on duty, she stepped out of her station to go to a deli next door, and she was stabbed multiple times because she was wearing a uniform. So we'll discuss the role that uniform plays in some of this. And
yes. So there were 5 hands raised.
5 hands raised for the physical.
Yeah. And then also somebody texted me and asked to clarify whether this was by patients or families or by other providers, other staff.
Yes, and yes. When it comes to the workplace violence, all of these things count because they're all very real threats for all of us in real time. So the answer is yes to all of the above.
Thanks.
Absolutely, which is a perfect segue into this slide. I mean, what exactly is workplace violence and how is it defined? The key agencies in the United States, the key agencies that look at workplace violence and define it are the Center for Disease Control and NIOSH. And so their definition together is violent acts, including physical assaults and threat of assaults directed toward persons at work or on duty. What's interesting is they don't really include the psychosocial and the stress mediated part of it. The World Health Organization that looks at this not only in the United States, but across the world, has a different definition that includes the psychosocial component of it and defines it as incidents where staff are abused, threatened, or assaulted in circumstances related to their work, including commuting to and from work, involving an explicit or implicit challenge to their safety, well-being, or health. And as some of our colleagues in asking the question to Sean just said, what is it when we ask, have you been a victim of workplace violence? What exactly are we talking about? It isn't clear. It depends on which definition you use. And Scott, do you want to talk for a second about the black box here? This is your area of expertise.
So when we talk about the higher rates, overall, well over 1 million people a year are injured on the job due to workplace violence. Tracking it becomes very difficult. One of the few things that we're able to track are the injuries, especially on the job, whether they're reportable to OSHA or whether you're working for a hospital system or a fire department where you're sent to an occupational health. The challenge that we have in particular in dealing with the workplace violence is the uncontrollable field and the absolute uncertainty of every call we run to. A lot of training that we do revolving around the hospitals has its own set of threats, but they're a lot more contained. Ours are changing second to second. And the other part of this that we don't look at very often is the stuff that happens back at the station, because that could also be a component of some of this.
Great. So epidemiology, big word, the study of numbers, and statistics might seem unimportant until you become one of them. And the goal of tonight's exercise in getting you home safely.
Statistics might seem unimportant until you become one of them. I like that.
Right. So the goal is to make sure that you don't become one of them. That is the important factor. But we gain knowledge by looking at reporting. And so let's take a look at some of the information that's out there. And as I mentioned earlier on, there are a few good studies, there are limited good data, and very little research that's being done up till now. Clearly, it's an area that's gaining interest. So the four significant references that we use for the information in the next couple of slides are from Pre-Hospital Disaster Medicine, a 2018 article that was quite good. Murray and group did a systematic review looking retrospectively at workplace violence against emergency medical services. The National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians did a survey in 2019 where they asked all of their members through a series of questions, not unlike the questions we asked you earlier on in the presentation. And they came up with some recommendations and some findings. We'll go over that. And then I added, Gabe Kellen played a critical role in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Hopkins, and was there in 2010 when there was a shooting incident. I'm not sure if any of you remember this. Sean, you probably do, where there was a patient, elderly woman who was diagnosed with a terminal cancer condition. And when the physician told her son, he went home, got a pistol, came back, shot the doctor survived, ended up shooting his mother, pulled the gun out and was aiming it at people within the facility, and ultimately ended up shooting himself. The findings were interesting. That is hospital based, but there is a significant component of that affects us in the pre-hospital setting, and we'll go over that in the slide coming up shortly. There's a question in the chat.
Just a comment, sir. One thing I will challenge all the, I see Doc Vitberg's on here and some other high-level officers. So one of the challenges we have trying to define this is, how do I report this? If somebody spits at me and I'm not reporting it as a bloodborne exposure, if somebody takes a swing at me, somebody actually connects but doesn't really hurt, do we have a mechanism of reporting any of that and a way of tracking any of that? I will say our experience on the hospital side is it definitely varies from system to system, but most of them have some sort of a mechanism of reporting within their medical database. That may be something that we might want to look at from our county's perspective to maybe try to get a handle on some of this.
Yeah, and so as we look at the literature, some of the numbers are quite impressive. Emergency medical service personnel have a rate of violence that is 22 times higher than the average for all workers. That puts us way above any other line of work. In the surveys that were done, and again, definitions matter, so we have to take these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt, but 91% of EMS providers reported being verbally assaulted while practicing EMS. And it's interesting, if we take a look, so Sean, the original number was 12, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, 12 out of how many people do we have on the?
60 at the time.
Okay, so we're at 20%. So that's substantially lower than what the national average is. And then 67% have reported being physically attacked while on duty. And again, we don't know what physically attacked means, whether that means they were injured, they weren't injured, but they were at least perceived themselves as being physically attacked while being on duty. 10% of those incidents, the perpetrator used a weapon, and 90% of those were patients, with about 5% were family members and 5% were others. I think that the numbers of family members, I think that's woefully underreported. Alcohol and drugs, as we would expect, were prevalent, and males were more likely than females, and younger workers were more likely than older workers to get that. So the last time the numbers were differentiated was 2016. There were roughly 3,500 responders that were taken to the emergency department because of injuries sustained from violence. Again, I would suggest that was underreported then, and if we were to look at the numbers now, I think it would be substantially higher than that. I think all of us in the healthcare clinician department and services would agree that during and post-COVID, the level of stress and the propensity for violence, the shortness of tempers, has significantly increased. So I think these numbers are going to be higher. And then what was disconcerting is that assault was the cause for 8% of fatal injuries in EMS. And that fatal assault was found to be the third lead, so homicide of an EMS provider was found to be the third leading cause of death for EMS workers upon review of 3 of the larger fatality databases. We'll talk in a little while about protocols, when to go in and treat and when to make a tactical retreat, a tactical withdrawal. I think there is some discussion as to what is our responsibility of what we're going to do when we see a weapon on the scene. And it is important that we look at the OSHA General Duty Clause, which is sort of the governing federal statute on how this works. The Duty Clause of 1970 at Section 5A1 says that the workplace has to be, quote, free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So recognize that in the line of work that we do in both EMS and fireside, there are going to be hazards that may potentially cause significant injury or death. What can we do to mitigate those? But from a workplace violence perspective, and as Scott was talking about earlier, it's a recognized hazard within healthcare industry. Therefore, we have an obligation as an agency to put programs in place to mitigate that. And therefore, no EMS responder must be unreasonably placed in such a position that their life is in jeopardy. The problem is that we are expected both by the community and amongst ourselves to sometimes put our lives on the line. And the question is where? And this general concept was explored in that 2019 National Association for Emergency Medical Technician report on violence.
As a jurisdiction, we do well staging, waiting for police, and that's a good basis of where that comes from. But again, that's all predicated upon us getting proper information prior to arriving.
Yeah, Scott, that's absolutely correct. It's a critical point, and we're going to talk about staging in a little bit. I think we have done well instituting the staging concept. I mean, I think it saves lives. Yes.
So there's a question that says, does assault include sexual intent / assault?
The answer is yes, it can. It can. And what is interesting is in the hospital environment. So Scott and I spend a fair amount of time talking to in-hospital clinicians and staff. And so we have unfortunately heard of cases where there have been sexual assault perpetrated from one employee upon another. So the answer is absolutely, it is a significant component of workplace violence. And so I'm not going to belabor Gabe Callan's study too much, except that last line, which is that almost a quarter of all the shootings within the emergency department, the weapon was actually taken from either the police officer or the security officer who was there to protect. And as EMS clinicians in the pre-hospital setting, we are faced with this question of, do we want, first of all, there is a big movement afoot now asking across the country, do we want to have armed EMS providers? There's no right or wrong answer about that, but if you take that in the context of 25%, almost 25%, almost a quarter of the shootings were done by a security officer, there is a clear risk of having a weapon on the scene. And then the second part that I would throw out there, and we can discuss policy in a little bit, is there's a discussion when we have a violent patient or a potentially violent patient or an assaultive or aggressive patient, we sometimes ask to have a police officer accompany us in the back of the medic unit. You can ask the county police officer to remove his weapon and to have it secured with another officer while he is in the back of the unit with us. But many officers simply won't do that. And they will then come back at you and say, well, if you want me on board, I either come with my weapon, and if you don't want me to have my weapon, or if you don't want me on board with my weapon, I will drive behind you. And if you run into an issue, you'll pull over and I'll come help you. So, I'm throwing this out there as a sort of a thought-provoking concept. Do we want to have weapons in the back of a unit with an assaulted patient when we know that there's a high degree of likelihood that that weapon could end up being used against us? And we'll discuss that a little bit more. And then let's talk about this concept. Scott, you can address this as you want, this concept of patient assessment, a rapid patient assessment, what that means. And we're all used to doing that versus a threat assessment that we are not used to doing. And Scott and I feel pretty strongly that should be something that we add into the mix about
Right. Everybody's used to the scene safety BSI, the stuff I've beaten to your head as a MIFRE instructor all these years. Putting in, if you come to some of our practical stuff you've seen, the threat assessment has to be minute to minute to second. As soon as somebody new enters the environment, your threat assessment has to start over again. As soon as somebody's behavior changes, somebody goes unconscious, we're going to start back at the CABs again, right? So that same type of mentality has to apply to the threat around you. And watching, and we're going to get into the specifics of what you can look for, but your mentality has to start changing to not only orient focused on the patient, but one of us absolutely needs to keep an eye on everything and everybody else around us. That could be everything from pets to other people, to people on the phone, people on a video that we're not aware of that are also listening in. So just a new type of assessment we want you to add to your Rolodex. And
I would add to that when we talk about this concept of patient assessment, this is not the one where you're taking vital signs and you're looking at their previous history and they're looking at their medications. This is the gut level patient assessment. We are all as clinicians used to walking into a home or walking into a situation where the patient is awaiting care. And in the first 2 to 5 seconds, we have formed in our opinion, sort of in our gut, at a gut level, we formed an opinion, is this patient really sick? Or are they not really sick? Are they acutely ill or are they not acutely ill? It's a gut feeling. And then we can go on and do, all of the standard stuff that all of us do when we do a more careful and focused assessment. We should develop the same concept. There should be a 2 to 3 second head to toe scan. Is there something on the patient, near the patient, or in the environment that can rapidly digress and become a threat against us? So we look at the patient assessment for the patient's well-being, but we have to get into the mindset of doing a threat assessment for our own well-being. And so this is an ongoing scenario, right? You start with a patient assessment, you do a threat assessment immediately. As the scene changes, as Scott said, as people come into the scene, as there are more people that are sort of gathering around the incident, as you are moving location. So there may not be a threat if you are treating the patient in the bedroom, but if you have to stop in the kitchen and you've got a potentially violent patient and there's a kitchen knife lying there on the countertop, that threat assessment to you has changed. So this is an ongoing situation, and scene size up is a dynamic process. So you never forget the first time you look at the wrong end of a shotgun. This picture obviously is set up. The scene is not a hypothetical scene. As Sean mentioned, I've been doing this stuff almost in excess of 40 years now. And when I was a relatively new EMT, we got a call for a burn patient in Owings Mills at Enchanted Hills. We got a call for a burn patient, and we were basic life support unit. I knocked on the door, and that's what I saw when the door opened. And that makes a big impression on you. And I cannot to this day remember exactly what I said, but obviously it worked because I'm here to tell the story. But we don't know what is going to happen. We don't know what's on the other side of the door. And in the meantime, I have learned, which hopefully all of you, if you haven't learned it, you will by the end of the night, don't put yourself in the kill zone. And we're going to talk about, unfortunately, somebody else who did not have the same success as I did, and did not survive to tell about it. But you don't know what is on the other side of the door, and you have to anticipate the unanticipated. You have to anticipate a problem on the other side until proven otherwise. So, Scott, you want to talk about this a little bit?
So yes, a couple of things. So knowing when to leave and then knowing when things change. So I know of one provider in our county who was doing a patient assessment. They were in the room several minutes. Everything seemed to be going okay till the decision was made. It was time to transport. Patient was pretty adamant they weren't going to transport, reached underneath the cushion they were sitting on and drew out a handgun. Changed the whole dynamic of the conversation. So at that point, crews were able to fortunately de-escalate, left, didn't force the issue, brought in the police, got it resolved. But you got to be prepared to do a tactical withdrawal at some point. Now we get into the conversation of if we come into the room and we see weapons are out, especially with the plethora now of people getting their carry permits, we're going to find these things a lot more than we ever have. Your gut has to be your deciding factor. That weapon has to get put away. It has to get saved. You've got to make a decision whether or not you need to back out right away, which most of the time I would encourage you to do, and let somebody else come in there, i.e. the police, come in, safe the room, safe the weapon, and we not get involved in it. Where we're going to have a situation is where we're picking up somebody, we're doing a head-to-toe assessment, we're making them trauma naked, and then we find the weapon. Then the question is, now what? So a couple things. One, if we have not started patient assessment and we haven't put our hands on the patient yet and things don't seem right, back out, call for assistance. You got several levels. You can simply call for a medical box. You can call for an engine, call for a supervisor, or you can call signal 13 if necessary, but be prepared to get out. Get your ambulance, tactically relocate somewhere else so the scene can be safe, then you guys can be brought back in. Now, you're coming across a weapon during a patient assessment. There's a couple of things. If there's somebody there that absolutely knows how to save a weapon, especially if we're already in the back of the medic unit. This time of year, you've got a high significant, you've got a pedestrian struck. Throw them on a backboard, throw them on the cot, get them in the back of the medic unit because it's 0 degrees outside, and we find the weapon. Now we have to deal with it. If police are on the scene, obviously we're going to get them right away. The one thing I will tell you is if you don't touch the trigger, that gun's not going to fire. With that being said, we have to do something so that the person themselves cannot get quick access to it and cannot make use of it. So there's other trainings that folks can take to become comfortable with that. We're not going to spend much time on it. I will just overemphasize clearing a weapon is not part of our job description. And if you're not 100% sure of what you're doing, you need to get somebody that is.
Right, and the other thing that and, you know, we've had some discussions with leadership and with people who have a significant amount of experience with firearms. And one of the things that's been brought up is that there's a difference in the safety factor of a weapon that is a factory, straight from the factory firearm. So it has not been adjusted, and you can assume that it is safe unless the trigger is pulled. Again, recognizing that no weapon is ever safe, but it's designed not to fire unless the trigger is pulled. However, there are many weapons that are purchased that are not factory designed, or they have been factory purchased and they've been modified,
Altered, yes,
in order to have a much lower resistance to cause the trigger to fire. So we cannot ever assume that the weapon is factory spec'd, and it really makes a big difference in terms of our safety. So the general feeling is, if you see a weapon, it's time to make a tactical withdrawal. Again, it can be a decision at the last minute, depending on the status of the patient. But the general go-to should be leave the scene and then have police department come in and clear it. It is not worth getting a second injury in order to take care of a patient.
Hey,
while we're
Coach,
talking about police officers,
Coach,
if we
something
come
happened
across
to
a police
your
officer that's been injured, we are not to touch that weapon. We protect that officer until another officer gets there and secures the weapon and secures their duty belt. But that is one time that we're not going to be getting involved in doing anything to clear or take it away. Officers have a holster that has a retention in there, so there's a certain way you need to get it out of the holster. So again, just if we're coming across a police officer, if we have to cut the belt, I would cut the belt, keep moving, doing your trauma. Don't let that stop you, but do not touch that weapon and make sure an officer secures it as soon as that first officer arrives.
Sean, you were going to say something?
Yeah, because your video, we lost your video.
We lost my video. Better?
Yep.
Okay. I didn't realize, I thought that it was just the screen. Got it. Okay. So this is a critical component. If you can't see their hands, you might not see your future. And as we go through sort of this training, we went through this training at the Ridge, sort of in a modified version not too long ago. And we have had issues where people have come across, providers have come across a patient and they pull back the blanket and, you've got a 75, 80-year-old gentleman who's holding a gun. That's a problem. And the other thing, and we're going to talk about special class of special needs and special class of people later on. But one of the things to keep in mind is that if you have somebody who's ex-military or ex-law enforcement, and they are not feeling well and they are home, if they're suffering from PTSD, they may not intend to hurt you, but they may also not be cognitively able to discern you as a healthcare provider versus a threat. And so I will give you an example. We had, and he has since passed away, we had a firefighter at Chestnut Ridge who was ex-military. And he and I had a conversation wherein he told me, if my family ever calls you and tells you that I'm having chest pain and you get to me in the middle of the night and I'm sleeping, do not come into my house or into my room until you have verified that I'm fully awake. I have moments where I don't know where I am. I sleep with a firearm under my pillow, a firearm under my bed, and I will shoot you even though you are my friend. So we have to keep these aberrations in mind for our own safety. And we'll talk about that special class later on. But we need to be able to see people's hands, and you must get into the habit. If you can't see their hands, you cannot assure your own safety. That's a foundational principle of police care, and we should get into the same habit on the fire side. So let's look at this concept of situational awareness, which becomes critical. For those of you who will recognize the gentleman laying there as BK, and this was used as a training scenario. You have to ask yourself a bunch of questions. Is this a crime scene? Yes, no. Are there weapons? Yes, no. If there are, is there a threat to providers? Yes, no. And what are the physical capabilities of the patient? So let's actually go through this. Does somebody want to pipe in? What do you see that's a problem, and what are some of the things we need to be aware of?
Yeah, let's put things in the chat, you guys.
I see an awful lot of my former students out there, so I should better get a pretty good assessment. So we've got a male, adult male, laying on a bed in an obvious pool of blood.
Blood on
Patient
sheet,
appears to be unconscious.
blood on the bed. Unconscious, blood, potential weapon in crotch.
Right. So if we came in and found this, we got the call as an injured subject or a sick subject or somebody that indicated that it wasn't a threat or we wouldn't have been here. And so that's the kind of scenario that we're setting up as we walk in and you find this. So now what? If the police are in, they've secured the scene and we're just coming in to treat and or pronounce, that's one thing, but you're walking in and finding this.
And so, as Sean said,
Okay, knife in pocket. Yes, that is correct. And they indicated that because if you look at his right front pocket, you can see the clip on the outside. It could be a money clip, but more than likely that's going to be a knife. Pile of clothes,
other
hiding
comments?
something underneath. Good.
I can't see the comments on my end, so you'll let me know when.
Okay. Yeah, that's why I'm reading them out loud. Back out and call for additional resources, and pocket knife could also have other items nearby. Oh, there's an item nearby. You guys are looking right at it. I'm not sure you guys recognize what you're seeing, but it's right there. Don't have to look under the bed. Patient is largely physically intimidating if they wake up, yes. Was it suicide? What is that blue thing in between his legs? That's the training rifle. Yes, the blue thing in his lap was the shotgun that probably caused this. So once you guys determine that we now have what we appear to be a suicide, I say appear because none of us are going to investigate and make that determination, but on the appearance, that's how we're going to look at this. What do we do next? Yeah, at this point, we need to step out. We don't need to pronounce. We don't need to do anything else. We need the police come in there, secure the scene, because we don't know what's going on. This is definitely a huge threat to us because we have no idea what's going on, who brought us in here. This is the absolute time to back out, call for the assistance. We're not going to leave the scene, right? We're not going to abandon, but we're also going to back out, get ourselves to a safe location. Let's see, was there anything? Okay, yep.
Yep. So let's talk about the situational awareness round 2, weaponizing our tools. If you look at the literature, so when we started doing this workplace violence and de-escalation stuff well before COVID, we were teaching this to groups of 100 to 150 people in an auditorium, all healthcare workers in an auditorium in various hospitals. And I would ask the group, we would all sort of ask, how many of you in this group have either been choked by your stethoscope or heard of somebody being choked by their stethoscope? And in every single group, there would be at least 2 or 3 people who had either been choked by their stethoscope or heard somebody who was choked by it. If you look at the literature, it happens all the time. That also goes for men if you're wearing ties, women if you're wearing scarves, if you're wearing identification lanyards that are not breakaway lanyards. Choking is a significant problem out in EMS world, where patients are either purposefully being assaulted or not cognitively aware and can be assaulted. So I'm just curious, in the group that's listening, has anybody ever heard of or been assaulted by their stethoscope? And you can raise your hands, and Sean, you can let us know that one as we go as well. And then other tools that we have close by that are our tools, right? We use bandage shears, we use hemostats, we've got needles that we use all the time. The spring-loaded center punch is a lethal device if it gets into the wrong hands. Most of us carry pocket knives of one kind or another, the trauma shears, a simple carabiner, which, you know, we carry our keys, we carry our equipment, we carry a water bottle. If you slip your fingers through that, it becomes a very effective pair of brass knuckles. And so again, the literature suggests that these tools become highly problematic. We cannot have them within reach of the patient. And that's in and of itself, that can be challenging. I mean, if we carry it on our belt and we are on the side of the patient in the back of the medic unit and they wake up and they're combative, can they reach our tool belt and use those things against us?
Additionally, think about the back of your medic unit. If it's not bolted to the wall, and even if it is, I'm just going to rip it off and throw it at you, as we saw that happen here. So our crew went on a call for a sick subject. You guys will recognize 130 Slade right there. So crew's upstairs working, assessing the patient. Somebody knocks on the door and said, hey, some guy downstairs ransacking your ambulance. So I've got a big giant EMT and the female paramedic. And of course, the female paramedic, she's like, oh, I'm going to go check this out. So she goes downstairs and the gentleman rips the sharps container off the wall, throws it out at her. It hits the ground, shatters, and now she has a bunch of needles coming at her in a pretty rapid fashion. Obviously, she was able to get out of there, not get injured, calling for the police. And you can see that he pretty much had his way of throwing stuff out of the back of the medic unit at everybody. And anything they could put their hands on could very easily become weaponized. So that could be within the house, within the ambulance, walking, if you're just on the stretcher, walking out of their house, anything that they can grab on you, things taken out of your tool bag. So all these things we need to be cognizant of.
Right, and also when you're doing procedures, so recognize that you're putting yourself potentially at risk. If your hair is long and you're leaning over to start an IV on a patient who's on a stretcher and they suddenly grab your hair, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to safely get out of that? Have you worked together with your teammates in order to figure out, your crewmates in order to figure out how you're going to resolve that issue? And again, think outside the box. When you talk to enough people, you start hearing strange things, people being strangled with IV tubing. So again, this is all part of that threat assessment. What is there on the person, near the person, or in the environment that potentially can be used against me? So as Scott said, I mean, he's been teaching us EMT stuff for a long, long time and has really drilled into all of us this concept of scene safety. And we all go into the scene and say scene safe, BSI, et cetera, et cetera. But what does that really mean? What defines a truly safe scene, or a scene that is as safe as you can reasonably expect it to be? When we go to the house, can you see into the scene? Are we stopping to take an extra second to look into a window, either the window of the door or a window next to the door? Are we positioning ourselves to the side of the door, that we stay out of the kill zone? And again, we're going to talk about that in a second, where we look at the tragic case that happened in PG County. Do we understand and do we plan for the difference between concealment and cover? When we recognize there's a problem, do we know where we can go and find cover? Do we know how far is the medic unit if we have to hide behind the engine of the medic unit? Is it parked in such a way that it protects us? Are you easily identifiable as fire and EMS versus just wearing your street clothes? If we're volunteers, sometimes we respond in our street clothes, versus the police department. When I first started doing this stuff and people came up and were wearing fire department identifiable clothing, you could tell people we're here to help, and even the bad guys were willing to accept you for the most part and let you help. That has changed. Today, we don't get any more protection or credit than do our police colleagues. So we have to, we have to make sure that we are identifiable as good guys. And a critical component, and when you look at the after action reports of many of these workplace violence injuries in EMS, did we have all the pertinent information about the scene, about the occupant, the history? Did dispatch tell us about firearms if they were there? Did they ask about firearms? And it was interesting, that call that I showed you early on when I walked in and I saw the shotgun facing at me, that came in as a burn patient. What I didn't know until after the fact is that she was burned as a result of a domestic violence situation. And so when the gentleman came to the door with the shotgun, if I had known that this was domestic violence, it would have been vastly different. And in those days, we did not have the police department stage early. So when we got there, we went in. That has now changed, luckily. And then let's talk about rapid egress. Do you have an unblocked way out? All of us have at some point or another gone into a hoarder house where you have to sort of walk through a maze in order to get back to the patient. If you have to make a rapid egress, if the patient ends up having a weapon back there, or a family member comes and has a weapon, do we have a second way out? Is there a way out without having to step over a bunch of tables, a bunch of books, a bunch of TV sets, and everything else that's there? And are there other people in the house that might pose a threat? One of the questions that we must get into the habit of asking, is there anybody else in the house? If the answer to that is yes, then our threat assessment is not over until we have seen that second person. And again, always expect the unexpected. Scott, what did I miss on that weekly scene safe stuff?
Absolutely nothing. In the training, if you guys recall, I always encourage you to keep something in your hand. Why? Because if somebody is doing something to you, they're expecting you to take it. So if I have a clipboard in my hand and somebody makes an aggressive move towards me, if I throw my clipboard at them, they're going to go through a 4-step process called an OODA loop. They're going to observe, orient, observe, decide, and act. Every time something's coming at you, your brain has to go through that process. When your brain hits that reset and is now reassessing its own threat, that gives us our opportunity to escape. So that's how we're going to use it, and we're going to use that OODA loop in our favor, and we're going to get them distracted. We're going to make them, because if I throw something at your face, you're going to deflect it. So that's our chance, and we make sure, as the senior folks, we're used to doing this, but make sure that everybody else, and we're the last ones out, and once we're out, until the police come and make it safe, we're out. But be prepared to do that quickly.
Right, and the other thing that we don't always think about, sometimes we do, but we don't always, and we should get into the habit of always think about it. Are we blocking our own path? So if the door is being blocked by our LP-15s and by our stretchers and by our trauma bags and our medical bags, if we are blocking our own egress, then we are getting in the way of rapid withdrawal if we need to. So just some things to keep in mind. So unfortunately, let's talk about this scenario in PG County that happened in 2016. And some of you may actually have known the paramedic Schneider who was killed. This came in as a check on the welfare of a patient. It was the brother of the patient who called. He hadn't been able to speak to his brother for a while. It was a known history of diabetes, a known history of hypoglycemic episodes, and a known history that the man had weapons, which he had never used for illegal purposes, but there was a known history of weapons in the house. Unfortunately, they did not wait for the police department. They knocked on the door with the brother there. The noises of knocking on the door and of trying to use the key to open the door were sufficient to cause the patient inside to wake up and to be scared that somebody was trying to break in. He got a gun and then ended up firing as they were making entrance. It killed the paramedic, wounded the EMT, wounded the brother and 2 other firefighters that were there. And if you look at this scene, I mean, it's one that we see every single day. What could we have done in making our approach to preempt a catastrophic outcome like this? Just look at it for a second. I mean, could you have gone look through the windows? So the windows have curtains there. Could you have stood to the side? It's relatively narrow. Do you want to have everybody there next to the door at the same time, or do you want to have some people holding back? Could you have waited for the police department? And that was one of the findings. We'll see that on the next page. One of the findings they found. Would we have had a better outcome if dispatch had asked, or 911 operator had asked, are there weapons in the house, and transmitted that information to the responding units? So the contributing factors, police were not on the scene at the time. This is why Baltimore County Fire Department, it makes it a policy to stage when there's potential for violence. Keep in mind, we don't always know when there's potential for violence, so we don't always have the benefit of staging until it's too late. But if we know it, then we stage. Again, we talked about this firefighter identification part, lack of communication. And the last one, firefighter paramedics were not wearing ballistic vests or personal protective equipment. We now carry vests on our equipment, but we only use them for known tactical situations. And so again, is there room for discussion? When do you or don't you wear a vest? And I don't have an answer. I'm simply raising the question, which many people have asked. So the key recommendations that were learned from an evaluation of this incident: staging, which we already know. Police should be the primary agency initially assigned to do a check on welfare. Identity: make sure that we are easily identified as fire and EMS, and make sure the information is asked, and we can do that ourselves. If we don't have the information from dispatch and we arrive someplace, it is not inappropriate to ask as you're walking back to a patient, are there weapons in the house? Are there potential weapons? Has there been a history of violent behavior in the past? That is information you could actually get on your way back to the patient if that's an option. All right, I'm going to try and play something here. Hopefully it will work.
We started our patient care when all of a sudden a male stepped in the side door of the ambulance and identified himself as her son. Yeah. Okay. All right, hey, look, try not to get our blood pressure up, okay? You don't tell me nothing about my mother, man. Get out there. Get out. DPD.
All of a sudden, this guy, the patient's son, just lost it.
Fire need your help. Get out the truck. Get off of him. We responded to a motor vehicle collision with 2 elderly ladies. Still need PD. We were treating him and everything was going good when all of a sudden her son entered the truck, was yelling at her and cussing her, and a pushing match started, and the next thing you know, we had our hands full. All right, PD's officer. I'm the deputy chief of EMS and I want that man booked for assault on an EMT. Man, he put his hand on me first. My mom and everybody. I asked you to step out the unit. You failed to do so.
Okay, so just looking at this, in the context of prevention of an incident, and in the context of, as we're sort of going in the next 2 slides, of de-escalation issues, were they being de-escalatory? Did they have time to be de-escalatory? Sometimes you have time to evaluate the situation and get it under control through verbal means. That's hopefully most of the time. And sometimes you don't. So if you have somebody who's getting violent in the back of the medic, you need to get that person out of the medic. Clearly, this is what happened. And this is also you know, we have this discussion. Do you want to have family members in the back of the medic? The more people you have back there, the greater the likelihood that you're going to have some kind of an incident most of the time. There are some exceptions. We'll talk about that. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. The next one's a little bit long, so I'm going to cut that off shorter. But this question, when is the scene safe enough? And is there such a thing? All of us have been called to the scene where, you know, PD is there and the situation has not been completely stable. And we have to go through this process in our mind. Do we or do we not treat? And do we or do we not stay on the scene? So let's take a look at this.
What the fuck, man? You shooting for, man? Where's the gun? Where's the gun? That's everybody out here. What the fuck, man? You shooting for?
So the question I'll throw out at you, and we can discuss it for a second, is that scene safe enough to come in there and take care of that patient? Some of the questions that are probably worth asking is, once the gun is out of the guy's hand and he was shot by a police officer, once the gun is out of the guy's hand, nobody's applying a tourniquet. He clearly has a significant bleeding event that potentially is stoppable. Is this scene safe for EMS? Is this a swap, a swoop and go, scoop and swoop? I mean, what do we want to do here? So throw it out at the crowd. Would you go in?
Overwhelming number of no's showing up in the chat. You should be able to see the chat now.
Let me see if I can see it.
Correct. Police do not have control of the situation.
Heck no.
Exactly.
And like it was brought up earlier, there was a time where fire, EMS, police were given that respect and that courtesy. But we've all been on that scene where the crowd has just not been in favor of what was going on, and then we just get caught up in part of it. And that's the whole point of this, is where is it appropriate for us to be, and then when's it appropriate for us to bail out and wait for additional resources to arrive. This is definitely one of those times.
Let me see if I can get on the chat. Okay. Let's take a look at this one. Now, we'll take a look first and we'll discuss.
The man in the video you're about to watch just killed a police officer. The camera is in the booking room of the police department. This man killed a cop, was chased down and tackled by other police officers. He was searched and handed over to a transport officer who searched him. And what you're seeing here is after he's been transported to jail and is in the booking room for his initial processing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are not doing a careful enough evaluation of patients. It was interesting. When we talk about this in the in-hospital scenario, EMS gets on the scene, does an evaluation, police department gets on the scene, does an evaluation, secondary police department personnel get there. EMS finally takes the patient to the hospital. The patient gets there. We are always expecting that the person in front of us in the chain of care has evaluated the patient for safety purposes. And yet here, this patient went over and over again through a bunch of different police department units and personnel, and still was able to carry a weapon. So unfortunately for that gentleman, he turned the weapon on himself, but fortunately he didn't turn the weapon on any of the responding police officers. And so never assume that a patient is safe. Years ago, there was a patient that came into trauma that was was brought in from the detention center and was undressed, was in a gown, was taken back to CT, and it wasn't until he was in the CT unit that they actually found a blade that was wrapped up in between his buttocks. So, you know, it could have been used against any one of a number of personnel. So these are significant issues, and we are responsible for our own safety and for the safety of others. We cannot be careful enough.
We will tell you when we go to the hospitals, especially Franklin Square, Good Samaritan, Union, that is a significant complaint they have of EMS as of us not doing proper searches before we deliver folks. Trauma patients we do a pretty good job on. It's a lot of the medical ones that we're missing in with, and I will suggest that with the overabundance of today's carry permits being issued, you got a lot of people out there now. So you want to be looking in where their belt buckle is on either side, right or left, or even in their back. They're able to carry it around their ankle with ankle holsters, or they can wear it under their jacket with something that's kind of tucked underneath of their armpit. So these are all new areas that we're going to have to think about looking for. And then that's assuming that they have it in a proper holster.
So let's get into the de-escalation part of this thing. If I am just sort of sitting calmly on a bench and I am looking at my iPad or watch or whatever the case may be, everybody knows I'm not a threat. If I get up and I start pacing back and forth and looking at my watch and put my hands into my pockets and just keep on sort of looking kind of oddly irritated, I'm still not a threat. But in theory, most of us will say, okay, so you're now on the radar screen. And if we're in the living room with a patient and I'm a family member and I'm getting up and I'm starting to move things around and I'm coming over to you and saying, you know what, I've got a meeting, you're taking care of grandma, you've been in here much too long and I need you to get out of here, get her out of here, etc. I'm increasingly agitated. And then finally, if I, you know, grab a book or a pole or a weapon of any kind, I've become a significant danger. So that, imagine sort of this line that I have here. You can see my pointer? Yes? No?
Yes.
Okay. So if we look at this line that goes from calm to anxious to agitated to aggression, this is known as the behavioral continuum, and it's the slope of intervention. If we're calm, we don't really need to be concerned about it after we've verified that there is no immediate threat to us. When they're anxious, this gives us an opportunity to verbally de-escalate. When they're agitated, we can still verbally de-escalate, but we have to consider additional resources. Are we calling for more people? Do we need to consider police department? Do we need to bring in additional resources that we haven't previously thought about? When they become aggressive, then we need to act. And the main thing about acting at that point is leaving. It's consider tactical withdrawal, consider egress. One of the options we might have, or we might have to have, if we've got enough people there to help do it safely, is a physical and ultimately a medical restraint. And then at the very last step, if we are truly in a life-threatening situation for both injury and true life threat, then we can consider defensive maneuver. The goal of all of this de-escalation stuff is to break that chain of behavior anywhere along this slope until the very end where we have to do something else. Recognize that this slope does not have to be at an angle. It can be a very long and slow one going this way, in which case you have lots of time to try and de-escalate. But in some cases, it can be a straight line up. It can be from being calm 1 second until they're putting their hands around your throat and throwing you against the wall in the next. Clearly, at that point, you don't start saying to them, excuse me, and go through the various verbal de-escalation techniques that we're going to talk about in the next slide. So again, remember the slope matters. The length of the slope and the direction of the slope determines how you're going to act. And the last part of this is something called recovery. So after the situation is under control, you need to reevaluate yourself, your patient, and your team. Is there care for the caregiver? If you have somebody who's been injured, they get immediate care. If there's somebody who's been psychologically injured or the stress, they get both immediate care and consider longer term care when they get back to the station. Critical incident stress debriefing, peer support. There are a variety of techniques. We'll go over that in a second. When you bring a patient down into physical restraints and medical restraints, patient safety and monitoring vitals becomes absolutely critical. We have all seen the cases on the news where people have died as a result of being controlled in the wrong way after showing signs of aggression. You cannot institute patient care. You cannot institute patient medical restraint without appropriate patient care, and that includes end-tidal CO2, oxygen monitoring, and somebody who is specifically assigned to monitor the vital signs and verify the patient has good respiratory status. And finally, resource reallocation. If you've got people who are out of the incident who can no longer act in their capacity because the incident has changed their ability, you need to get additional resources in there and do resource allocation. So again, in all of the rest of this behavioral continuum and all the rest of this de-escalation stuff, consider this line. Where are you on the line, and what does the next step have to be? Scott, you want to cover some of this stuff?
So let's talk about what you guys can look at besides the obvious. So number one picture you're seeing, this guy there is 1,000-yard stare. He's looking through you. He's already focused on something else. And when he's going to act, he's going to act. So if they're looking through, ignoring you, I would turn around and try to figure out what they're staring at. It may give you some indication about what's about to happen. It may not. But at some point, when I see that, we need to back off. And the other thing is, if they can't touch you, most of the time they can't hurt you. So one of the first things we're going to do is create some space between us. So if something does happen, we have some reaction time. Ghost mentioned watch their hands. If I have a fist, there's only 2 things or 3 things I can do. I can knock on the door. I can punch you in your face. I'm not here to knock on the door. So if somebody's balling up like that, whether or not they're giving any other expression, they're going to do something with that hand. Arms brace follows the same principle. Pacing. You get there, we've got a patient that's just constantly pacing back and forth, may or may not be saying anything, may or may not be giving any other signs, but just that pacing alone from a distance, let's start trying to talk to the person and figure out why. It may not be anything that harmful. It may be the person just has some sort of a mental disability, and this is just kind of how they deal with stress, and that's their way of kind of walking it off. So it may not be a threat at all, but we need to assess it. Twitches, again, same thing. Is this normal? And then assess the entire way this person is looking at you, their eyes, their nonverbal cues. Lack of focus, hyperfocus can go back to that 1,000-yard stare. If they are talking, what is their tone of their voice and what is yours? And we could spend the next 2 hours just talking about us being the problem, where we're becoming the ones that are escalating our voice, that we're saying things that may be triggers to these folks without even realizing it. But we can control the tone of our voice, whether we're irritated, agitated, disgusted, whatever. Watch yourself. Posture and personal space. So a couple of things. One, keep something in your hand. That way you always have the ability to toss it, have that OODA loop, get theirs reset. If you can't touch you, they can't hurt you. We're in the back of that medic unit. We have nowhere to go. So constantly we have to be paying attention to what's going on with the patient. What do we have around us? Them being strapped down doesn't mean anything. We all know how easily they can get out of that stuff. Even if we have them in the one arm up, one arm down, we've all seen them get out of that as well. And then clothing not consistent with the environment. So what does that mean? So if I saw somebody wearing a trench coat, for example, I don't care what time of year it is, unless you're 90 years old, people just don't wear trench coats nowadays, for example. So if I see somebody wearing that, and especially if it's not a very nasty cold night out, my index of suspicion needs to go way, way up. Same thing with layers of clothes, things that are extra bulky, things that are making noise, or when I'm doing my little pat down, if I come across something that seems metallic, where it shouldn't be, all these things have to start raising it.
And then
other things to be looking at are People around you, how are they responding when this person reacts? How is the person that you're talking to responding when other people in the environment are around us? We can try to control that. We've all seen that family member that escalates the situation. Or we're trying to calmly talk this person into going to the hospital and somebody behind us is screaming either the opposite or trying to force them to go. In any case, it's probably not being helpful. We don't know where that's going to go to. So all these things have to be added up.
Right.
And make a quick decision. Yes.
You skip perseveration. So those are the patients that are constantly repeating themselves over and over again, right? So
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Yep. So again, all of these combined, they give you a general set of clues whether or not this patient is going to become aggressive. Just a kind of a busy slide, but the 6 C's of crisis containment on the right-hand side of the line are the actions that we are required from us. The most important one of all of that is we have to remain calm. As Scott said before, our tone is going to determine the success or the lack thereof of our de-escalatory process. So if we can keep our tone calm, quiet, controlled, we have a much greater chance of breaking through to their emotional state. We have to
Coach, if I could jump in. Dr. Dean is on. He's one of our, is our assistant doc. And so he put in the chat here talking about the way we position ourselves when we're talking to a patient. So whether we're towering over them, whether we're down, making eye-to-eye contact, completely standing over them, when you're doing an assessment, yes, all of those can put you at a risk. And then think about a lot of the patients, especially an overdose patient, or somebody that's got a traumatic brain injury that's kind of coming in and out of consciousness, and they're just coming in and seeing glimpses of things happening. So yes, yes, thank you, Doc.
Yeah, and so civility, there's something called tactical civility. We may not necessarily want to be civil to somebody who's being aggressive to us, but it is our goal to get them to calm down. And so it is required of us to be professional and to act with civility, even when it's counterintuitive. And we are healthcare providers. We must provide compassion, even to troubled patients. And that involves active listening. We'll go over that in a second. It involves active listening, reflecting to others that we are not only listening, but we are hearing what they are saying. We're processing what they are saying. We are thinking about what they are saying, and we are going to act compassionately to try and de-escalate their situation. In return for our abilities, we are hoping for the desired results of their cooperation, their collaboration, and ultimately their compliance. And this is an ongoing loop. So as they become more compliant, we remain calm, we continue to act with civility until you see how this goes. All right.
So put in perspective, we go back to the slide 1 second, Coach. So put in perspective, we have a patient that's trying to refuse, right? So ultimately our game plan for every 911 call is to get that patient to the hospital. We'll just use that as a standard, right? So initially they're going to kind of argue with us. We're going to be very directive. Sir, ma'am, you're very sick. We don't like what we're seeing. Give your description. Can you at least agree that we're going to get you to the hospital? We're going to let them check you out. And then if we need to do anything else, then we can talk about it there. Once they buy into your plan, whatever our ultimate plan is, then things tend to calm down. But it's trying to find that one connection with them and the one thing that we have in common and get that conversation started, and then keep moving in a direction that puts them where we need them to be. Eventually, most of these patients, if we're direct, educational, and tactful about it, typically will comply, especially if we're always acting in the interest of getting them to that higher care facility. Thank you.
So the goal of de-escalation in general is to use verbal and nonverbal techniques, and it turns out that nonverbal is really important to reduce the tensions and conditions which are causing them not to get the care they need. That includes emotional care as well as medical care. Recognize that no matter how, quite frankly, annoying, escalated, how difficult, how disrespectful these patients are, they are that way because they are in crisis. And you are there to offer care, comfort, safety. And we have to remember that whatever we are de-escalating, we are offering them short-term solutions to the extent that we are only trying to get the crisis at that moment under control. We cannot offer them long-term care. That's not our goal, that's not our purpose, and we can't promise that. We can only promise to change the situation in a in a tactical way for that moment to bring calm to the scene. We're trying to bring down the temperature in the room. We are not trying to win the argument. And it's very difficult for us. I mean, most of us are, type A. That's why we're in this EMS side of healthcare. We are used to winning our point of view, winning against illness, winning against death, winning against crisis. We can't do that here. The goal here is just to bring the temperature of the room down. And we'll go over some techniques on how best to do that. So it's the use of communication, which can only happen when you are both speaking and listening, and using other non-physical skills to calm and reassure agitated and angry patients. The ultimate goal of all of this stuff is to prevent the hands-on, to prevent a physical confrontation. That's it's the option of last resort. It's our last go-to. And if we recognize the danger signs and we remember that line of aggression that we looked before, behavioral continuum, if we can break the line anywhere across there, we will go ahead and win our position. So, and just to go over, we're trying to ensure the safety of patients and responders and bystanders. We're trying to help the patient manage his or her emotions and regain control over both his or her behavior and the scene. Ultimately, we're trying to avoid the use of restraints whenever possible, except for the dire circumstances where somebody else is in danger, we're in danger, or the patient's in danger. And we are trying to avoid actions that escalate the situation. Now, there are a bunch of approaches to de-escalation. It is an alphabet soup. We will go over just briefly one slide at a time to show you, and then we'll focus more on the model that I think is the most effective one, and we'll address that. The commonly used model is LEAPS, to listen to the patient, to empathize with the patient and understand why they are feeling the way they're feeling, to ask questions with the intent of listening and hearing carefully what the answers to the questions are, and to rephrase those questions to them, to paraphrase what we hear. So what I understand you to say is, and then repeat to them what it is, so that you are both on the same page. And ultimately, you want to summarize, telling them what you understand, and allow them to save face. Allowing somebody in crisis to perceive themselves as saving face is a huge component into building rapport with them. And rapport matters critically. Okay.
And a lot of that comes down to offering them options, letting them make choices, but only offering them options where both options work for us.
Right. We don't have an SOP on how to deal with de-escalatory situations. The only thing that we really have as a guide is our protocol, our SAFER model and protocol. And just to refresh your memory, SAFER stands to stabilize the situation. So just take a deep breath, understand what are the conditions on the ground, to assess and acknowledge the crisis, to show the person that you understand they are having a difficult time, and to offer your services to the best as you can to try and ameliorate the crisis, to facilitate resources, call in additional resources. We're going to go over the list of resources in a couple of minutes, encourage the use of those resources, and ultimately to promote recovery and get them to the appropriate care. The model that we like to use is a model called RAP, which stands for Recognize, Accept, and Plan. It's a bit of a busy slide, but we'll go over it briefly. This concept of recognize that the person is in crisis. They are having a stressful event, or they're having a crisis event. Understand also your own situational awareness. This goes back to recognize your situational awareness. This goes back to that threat assessment we were talking about early, and your own ability to perceive. If you are not able to build rapport, and you have somebody else within reach, or within radio reach, or within the context of the rest of your crew, who can build a better rapport with the patient in a smaller amount of time, that may be the right person to do the de-escalation, and you may not be. So recognize your own ability to proceed. Accept and acknowledge. So this sounds really basic. Treating a patient with respect, with kindness, with dignity, with care. But if they're in your face and they are being disrespectful and they're calling you every name under the book and spitting at you and doing whatever else they're doing, trying to act professionally then can be really challenging. So recognize this is not personal. They are in crisis. You are there to be professional and to make their situation better. Using active listening, which we discussed before, and empathy. Empathy absorbs tension. If somebody else who's in crisis recognizes that you genuinely care about them and you are genuinely there to help them through this situation, they will de-escalate most of the time. And finally, as Scott said before, come up with a plan that has to work for them and has to work for you. And as part of that plan, recognize what is your plan of egress if things go south. Give them options. All right, 5 principles. Scott, you want to go over that real fast?
Yep. So when we want things to happen, we've got to make sure that we're clearly communicating. Ask the question. So I get to the scene, I get out of the front seat, somebody runs up there, grabs onto my shirt. My mom, she's sick, I need you to come here. Sir, of course I'm going to come here, but can you get your hands off my shirt, please? Yes, sir, no problem, just follow me. So when you ask things very reasonably, but very directly and tactfully, people are going to respond most of the time appropriately. Setting the context. So this could be a lot of things, especially when we're talking about medical. A lot of our issues come up with trying to convince people to go to the hospital. And we come back to that. I come back to that a lot because that's where a lot of issues come up from us as providers and the way we interact with the patients and the providers. And recently there have been several incidents where our crews weren't setting the context properly and not really trying to get to the hospital. So we got to always want to try to get there. Remember, we have options when we're trying to do this. If patients don't want to go to the hospital, you can get supervisors. We can do consults with doctors. A number of folks we encounter, their choice is going to the hospital or going in the back of the police car. You put that in context, then most folks, again, are going to cooperate. That comes down to providing options. All right, so this is what's going to go. So, ma'am, you're going to go to the hospital. You're extremely sick. You can't stay here. It's cold outside. We're finding you sitting on a bench. We're not going to leave you here tonight. That's not a good option. Here's what the options are. What are we going to do? You're showing compassion, you're showing you're caring, and you're giving them very practical options. Confirmation. This is a tough one. So we get to the scene. We've got some folks that are arguing back and forth. We've got a 16-year-old female with horrible abdominal pains. Father's there. Friends of the father are there. Everybody's all riled up. How do we actually get the scene calmed down? So one of the things we can do in this is separate. So as the officer, I would try to talk to the family member. Sir, let's go into the other room. Let's give our providers and the patients some privacy to do this. So we're dividing and conquering, because once I get them out of sight, my patients should feel more apt to answer my questions. And another way to look at it, if I have a patient that's getting wound up and I can recognize it's a family member that's potentially causing it, we may need to separate them. In the field, from an ER perspective, we use gangs. I have one gang member that's in a room, somebody else is brought in from another ambo, they don't know each other's there. All of a sudden one sees the other, what could possibly happen. So allowing them to save face, putting them in separate rooms, not letting it get riled up. Another way of looking at this would be if we have to get a patient naked, look to everybody else. Look, we got to get your patient trauma naked. We got to start evaluating what's going on. Today, you're not going to see your friend like this. So let's go ahead. Let's get everybody out of here. That allows us to control the scene, lets the people know that we are treating the person. And most of the time, they're going to cooperate. But separating folks and keeping crowds will get each other amped up. So breaking that down and then getting your patient to the back of your ambulance where you have complete control of the environment is going to be the ultimate goal. At the end, if all this fails and we can't talk our way out of it, then we need to act. What does that look like? That's the thing that you guys got to decide. And that's where we're trying to give you some more tools in your toolbox so you have a lot of things to go to. But at the end of the day, tactical retreat has to be one of your prime considerations. And what do we mean by that? We're leaving with the intent of getting additional resources to regroup and go back in. We're not abandoning a patient. We're not leaving anybody there to die. We're making it so it's safe enough for us to go in there as a group. So that's why we call it a tactical withdrawal and not an abandonment.
And then
Scott, there was a great comment in the chat. Ask to move to a quieter location, preferably in the medic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's always our go-to place. We've all been on that call. I see a lot of folks from the west side. We've all been on a couple of calls at Milford Mill High School where there's been a bunch of incidents, and there's been a number of us where our only job was to be on the outside of that medic unit because everybody's friends and family were there and wanted to find out what was going on inside, and we just had to provide essentially leverage between us and the space between us and the medic to kind of give our folks inside a chance to work. So at the end of the day, ACT is where I need you guys constantly thinking, constantly having a secondary egress in mind, and constantly having your head on the swivel.
And one of the things that's really important about this concept of these five principles is that you need to be able to if you decide you need to go hands-on at the end of the day, and you have to use defensive force, you have to be able to legally show in a court of law or show in front of a jury of your peers why you chose to go hands-on somebody else, and that these de-escalatory verbal and non-verbal de-escalatory techniques did not work. So again, remember the slope of that behavioral continuum. It can be vertical, where you don't have time to do the verbal stuff, but most of the time it's not vertical. Most of the time it's enough of an angle that you can at least attempt verbal de-escalation. That should be your go-to. You're going to have to explain to the legal team why you ended up going hands-on. I know we're running a little bit low on time, so we'll go a little bit faster through the next couple of slides. This is basically a repeat, just a different alphabet, a repeat of everything we've done before. The key one to remember here, which Scott told you about earlier, is tone. Be calm, speak softly, speak slowly, leave your ego at the door. As long as we are non-threatening and we don't take it personally, we have the greatest ability to build rapport with somebody in crisis. Recognize that how you say something matters more than what you say in many of these situations. And the other takeaway on this, when you are trying to break somebody from going on and on and on and on, and you're trying to verify that you are actually able to understand what they're saying and show them that you understand what they're saying, a great line is, let me see if I understand you correctly, and then reflect back to them what you say. It makes sure that everybody's on the same page, and it confirms that you are actively listening to them. Okay. This is
So there's things that you say and things you don't say. So if you look on the left, if I say one of these things to you and you're already in crisis and you're already acting out, I'm just gaslighting you at this point. I'm going to, I tell you to calm down. That's not going to happen. If you say I understand, no, that doesn't really sit there. There's no, that doesn't resonate with them. If I use a comment like you people, that's it, we're done, because that you people, what am I talking about? People that are wearing glasses, that are wearing shirts? No, we're usually talking about somebody's skin color, somebody's religion, somebody's group of whatever they belong to, that we've just alienated everybody. So can't use that language. You need to listen to me. No, actually they don't. And they may decide that they want to do something else. So we don't want to set that up. You know, you need to come over here. Okay, well, what if I don't? Are you going to go over there and force them to? So don't use your own words to back yourself in a situation that you now have to go hands-on. All right, what is your problem? Well, obviously you're their problem, because now they're getting a little uppity with you. So really we shouldn't be going there. Stuff on the right-hand side on the green. Remind them we're here to help you, your tone, and remind them that we're here to work with them over and over again. If we don't really understand what they're trying to get to, because people are horrible historians, or they may have a communication problem because of their medical event or their traumatic event, just repeat, I'm trying to understand, please help me. Have them repeat things as many times as necessary, and then keep repeating back things as often as necessary to make sure that we have that 100% communication. I see why you might feel that way. Again, these are all non-threatening things. My favorite is, how do we work together to solve this? You know, we're here to help you. I understand you don't want to go to the hospital. I understand whatever. So figure that out. Once we come up with a plan that everybody agrees with, that's when everything goes really well, because now we're all working towards the same goal. But your phrasing and your tone will absolutely set this.
This is just verbal judo. I'm going to skip over this one for the sake of time. One more approach that basically repeats what we did before. And then Ari brought up the use of force continuum. This is just a depiction of that. And it's a busy slide, but many of you have probably seen this. The situation dictates how the patient is going to act. They're either cooperative, they are passively resistant, that is, they're just sitting down, they're actively resistant, they are not allowing you to touch them, they're assaultive, they're coming after you, or they're threatening you with grievous bodily harm or death. What you perceive, it says officer, this is designed for law enforcement, the same thing for us. What you perceive the situation to be determines your tactical consideration, how you approach it. Notice that throughout the entire scenario, whether they're cooperative, resistive, going all the way around, you are always addressing your perception and the tactical considerations. Communication, the green one on the outer thing. You are always trying to communicate with them. You are listening and you are trying to tell them what you can do for them throughout all the scenarios. If they become passively resistant, then the yellow part crosses over, and you can apply, most of this is PD, but you can apply soft approaches of physical control versus hard approaches. That is, are we going to apply restraints? Are we going to use chemical restraints? Are we going to use physical restraints? Are we going to request additional resources? And the answer to that last part is always yes. And then as they become more actively resistant and assaultive, you get into the orange area, which is intermediate weapons on the law enforcement side. Think along the lines of taser. In our side, think of the medications that we can use. And then the option of last resort is lethal force. And the primary goal of all of this de-escalatory stuff is to avoid everything on the left-hand side of this, and certainly to avoid lethal force unless there's no other option available.
Now, for you, if we can go back to that slide for a second, Coach, what it means for you guys is we have to step in properly where the patient is. If my patient's throwing things or they're actively trying to hurt me using my de-escalatory, sir, can you please come down and stop throwing things at my head? No, I need to be in a tactical retreat, or if I have no choice, come in the back of the medic unit, then I may have to make a decision to go either hands-on or escape or whatever it is. But I need you guys to recognize where they are and step in at that appropriate level with an appropriate frame of mind of where we're going to go next with it. If we are going to use force and we're going to go hands-on, the legal standard is using the least amount of force necessary to essentially stop the threat. If we're going to get involved and we're going to do a takedown, there needs to be engine, ambo, supervisor, law enforcement, needs to be a conversation, needs to be a plan, who's taking which limb. Are we administering medications? If we're administering medications, who's doing that, who is, and where the medication's going? When we're putting the person down there, this is a medical takedown, even if law enforcement's involved, meaning we've got to pay attention to them. They're still our patient. And no matter what we do, we can't hurt them. So if we get them in a position and either us and law enforcement have a person in a position and we recognize that their vital signs are being affected, they're putting up resistance, we don't tell these other folks to let them go. You let them know our patient's getting in distress, and as a group, we're going to have to figure out how to reposition, because we don't want to let go of limbs. We don't want to let them get any leverage where they're going to get up and hurt themselves or hurt us, but we also don't want to cause any harm to the patient. So I do need a higher level clinician or a senior provider to be in charge and just constantly monitoring everything that's going on and kind of being the one giving the cues of what to do next.
All right, I'm going to interrupt, Scott. We're pushing on the 8:30 hour. We're going to wrap this up within the 5 minutes. The most important thing about this particular slide is look at use the least amount of force necessary, as Scott said. Use only the defensive force commensurate with the threat, and document everything. You have to document it immediately after it happens. That way it carries the most amount of legal weight. Okay.
And if we do employ one of the restraint protocols, definitely we want to make sure that we're using the language from the protocol to justify why we're applying that protocol.
Yep. Don't be lulled into complacency with frequent fires. We all have them in our districts. If we know that they're troublesome and they've behaved most of the time, don't expect that they'll behave the next time. They can still be problematic. And then, bear with me 1 second. Special needs and special consideration patients, real fast. Patients with autism, if you tell them to calm down or you try to get them to calm down or you touch them, it can give them sensory overload and they will become more aggressive. So we have to recognize there are patients, Down syndrome patients, who do not like to be touched, who will become aggressive if they're touched in some cases. Traumatic brain injury, behavioral patients, patients with schizophrenia and paranoia, dementia patients, delusional, language barriers, drug patients and alcohol patients. Other conditions can mimic aggressive behavior. And finally, special consideration. And one of our members works in the military and advises, and it's important. If you've got somebody who is military or law enforcement, they have been trained to kill. They have been trained to be self-protective. And if they are in an altered state of mental capacity and you are there, you could be a victim of their violence. So they require special considerations when you do that. All right, the last part, when we don't pay attention to signs and symptoms, this is what can happen. Let you show.
Paul Tarashuk's family has filed a civil lawsuit against more than a dozen defendants, including law enforcement and paramedics. Now, among the items of evidence in the case is body camera video. A warning, some of what you're about to see is graphic. It's been a year of crippling emotion for Cindy and Paul Tarashuk. A year since the death of their 26-year-old son, also named Paul. Still not easy to talk about, is it?
No, it's talking about him gets me really upset. Talking about this stuff gets me angry.
Paul Tarashuk had schizoaffective disorder, suffering delusions and hallucinations. But he was getting on with his life until one night last September when he had a psychotic breakdown traveling along this highway near Orangeburg, South Carolina. Parked for a roadside break, a trucker suddenly saw Tarashuk walking toward him.
Naked man. Freaks me out. I take off.
As the trucker drove down the interstate, he realized Tarashuk was riding on his rig and called 911.
Come on down. What's going on?
Officers from 3 different law enforcement agencies responded, including Orangeburg County Sheriff's Deputy Clifford Dorowski.
Oh, he's under the influence. Nobody can see that.
Who was certain Tarashuk was high or drunk. Dorowski's body camera recorded what happened when EMS arrived.
You speak English? Hey.
Tarashuk didn't answer the first responders, who were berating and cursing at him.
I was being serious. I'm sleepy. Give me a damn name so I can go home for real. I'm tired.
So they shoved an ammonia capsule up his nose.
Breathe that in.
He didn't flinch.
At that point, someone should have stepped up and says, we got to take him in someplace. He's not just someone to let go.
Do you want to go to the hospital? Yes or no? Do you want to go to jail? Well, those are your two choices.
Come on, I'm going to give you a ride. You're not going to jail. You're not under arrest. I'm going to give you a ride. Give you a ride to a safe environment. That's all I want. I want to make sure you're all right.
The deputy puts Tarashuk into his cruiser, drives him 15 miles to this gas station near the county line, a gas station that was closed at the time. This is the last time Paul Tarashuk is seen alive.
It's just watching him walk to his death. He was escorted by an officer to his death.
I think I just hit a person on the interstate.
Nearly 5 hours later, the same EMS crew was called to deal with Tarashuk again, back on the same highway. This time, he was dead.
As a matter of fact, he was going to try to drop him off. We could just take him to the hospital and drive him in.
A toxicology report from the Orangeburg County Coroner's Office came up clean. No drugs, no alcohol. Despite this, Deputy Clifford Dorowski is still on the job at the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Department, and so is one of the EMTs.
They didn't do their job. That's it. They just didn't do their job. They didn't care enough about human life to do their job.
Paul Tarashuk's family.
Right, so this is why we do these cues and clues, and we have to recognize these patients are in crisis. They need medical care. We cannot just assume that they are drunk, they are drugged. We have to treat them appropriately. Resources during the incident and post-incident. If you run across one of these things, consider tactical withdrawal, stage, wait for police, wait for additional resources. If you run into an issue, signal 13, push the button on your radio. That's what it's there for. Request a medical box so you get additional personnel coming in there. Finally, you have your station officers that can help you, EMS supervisors that also carry additional medications if you need to use medical restraint. County Police Department has crisis teams. There are up to 4 crisis teams available, depending on what time of day it is. They will come with an unmarked car with an armed police officer and somebody who is either a social worker or a psychologist who specializes in de-escalations and negotiation. EMRC is always available to you. They can connect you with a variety of resources, including the emergency department. The suicide hotline is active at 988. You can have the patient call. You can call with the patient. And if you need it, you can call. We deal in high stress situations. That takes an emotional toll on each of us. The CISM team is always available, critical incident stress management from MIEMSS and from Baltimore County. We have the peer support services for us. as well as clergy and Department of Social Services. And the newsletter that came out last week, the November 26th EMS newsletter, Baltimore County now subscribes to this Cortical Wellness app. For those of you who are not familiar with it, you can scan into the app. Baltimore County has an account with them. Username is BCOFD, password is Wellness1, and there are a variety of resources available on there to help you deal with PTSD, sleep and stress, and so forth. Working with patients who are emotionally challenging in situations that need to be de-escalated takes its toll. Recognize that and recognize it's normal to feel upset if you're not successful, and that these are available to you. Just to let you know, the protocols have both the agitation for the adult, the medical approach, as well as our protocols cover the physical restraints. In the interest of time, I'll let you review that yourself. And finally, probability versus stakes. This is a picture of Dr. Howard Raskin, who lost his son, Danny Raskin, who was an investigator for the National Transport Safety Board in human behaviors. He was also a member of Chestnut Ridge, a lieutenant there. It sometimes takes a small chain of events, of seemingly small things, to create a catastrophic outcome. The likelihood of a catastrophic event cannot be the determinant of preparation, prevention, and education. You cannot afford to think to yourself, this is not going to happen to me, because it can happen to each one of us. And by planning, thinking ahead, recognizing the resources that we have, challenging ourselves to become educated about these kinds of patients, and leaning on each other and being supportive for each other, that's how we get through these things. It can happen to you. Your safety, the safety of your crew, and the safety of your patient is your responsibility every call, every time. Finally, we'll let you know that in the state of Maryland, a person who violates paragraph 2 and assaults an EMS officer, an EMS or firefighter, is guilty of the of a felony assault in the 2nd degree, and we are using the Virginia Department of Health, their poster as a general review. Situationally aware. Remember to do a threat assessment for yourself for every call. Verbal de-escalation is always preferred. Know when to do a tactical withdrawal. Report violence. If you don't report it, we don't know about it. If we don't know about it, we can't solve it and put policies in place. Know your rights, as we have here. Know what resources are available to you, as we discussed before. And the signs of a potentially violent patient, we've now covered sort of as we have. Any questions, guys? I know we went a little bit long. I apologize for that. Scott has put a lot of time into this. We put a lot of time into this. It's a lot of information. Questions, comments?
The conversation will continue. We'll be having another one of these programs first quarter of next year.
Really spectacular, guys. Thanks for being here.
Our pleasure. Question, Andrew?